So last week, Barrett kicked off our new series on finding rest. And he talked about the commandment that God gave us to remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. That is, the commandment for us to rest in the same way that God rested when God had finished creation. Resting not in the, I'm so worn out, I have no choice to do anything but rest kind of rest, but the, I don't want to miss this kind of rest. I want to take this all in. I want to enjoy every little bit of it. I don't want to miss a thing kind of rest. But I have to be honest, as I heard him preaching over at the traditional campus, I began to wonder how many of us, when we heard that call, began to think, well, that's well and good, preacher, but I got a lot going on in my life. I've got a lot of important things that I have to get done. I mean, I want to rest. I want to be refreshed like you're talking about. But me? Me? Rest? Really? I don't have time for that. And Barrett himself admitted to us last week that he would love to have 8-day weeks full of 25-hour days. But the fact of the matter is, if we had that, we'd just fill it up too, and then we'd be wanting 9-day weeks full of 26 or 27-hour days, and we'd eventually fill that up, and it would just go on and on and on. So what we're talking about in this sermon series isn't about finding more time to rest. What we're talking about is a shift in the way we think about rest. To shift from thinking, I'm too busy to rest, to say, I'm too busy not to rest. Shift in our thinking. And next week we're going to talk about how we're too busy not to rest in terms of our relationships with our friends and families. But today we're going to talk about how we're too busy not to rest for our own spiritual health. Because at its core, rest is truly an issue of faith. And we're going to learn that today by looking at someone in the Bible who's pretty important. We're going to learn that by looking at Jesus today. And I have to admit that this is the point where I was talking to people about the sermon throughout the week. This is where I have to admit I was tempted to say something kind of snarky. I was tempted to say, so you say you don't have time to rest. I'm sure you're probably right. I mean, Jesus had time to rest, but what he was doing was surely not as important as what you're doing. So, sure, I understand you don't have time to rest. But I decided that would be snarky, so I'm not going to say that today. But instead, I just want to say that we learn rest from Jesus. And we find it at the heart of the verses that are our theme verses for this series, coming from Matthew chapter 11, picking up at Luke chapter 11, picking up with Matthew chapter 11. I knew that didn't look right. Sign of Jonah. Matthew chapter 11, picking up with verse 28. These famous verses that you've probably heard many times, but I have to admit, when I began studying them for this series, I saw something in the middle that I'd never seen before about learning rest from Jesus. These verses read like this: "Come to me, all you who are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." But there in the middle, I'd never seen it before. Jesus said, take my yoke upon you. I'd heard that before. And learn from me. Never seen those words before. They'll learn from me. We're called to learn how to rest from Jesus. And if we look at Jesus' life and his ministry, we'll see that he's stopping to rest all the time. The most famous example was there in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night in which Jesus was betrayed. He'd stopped to rest. He'd stopped to reconnect with God the Father, to have his direction clarified, to be strengthened, renewed in his strength to face the journey ahead. And we tell that story every year during Holy Week, and that's one of the most famous times when Jesus stopped to rest and stopped to pray. But all throughout his life and ministry, every time you turn around, Jesus is stopping to rest. After he fed the 5,000, at the Mount of Transfiguration, before he selected the 12 disciples, we could go on and on and on. And then when the 12 disciples come back from their first mission, their first trip out to proclaim about the kingdom of God, when they come back, Jesus takes them away to rest on a little retreat so they can learn to rest from Jesus. But there's one particular instance of Jesus resting that I want to spend a little time on today. It comes very early in his ministry. In fact, Mark puts it in the very first chapter of his gospel. You could say it's Jesus' first big success in ministry. He'd been over at Simon, who's later called Peter. He's been over at Simon's house, and Simon's mother-in-law is sick. She has a fever. And so Jesus heals her of the fever. Well, when that happens, word spreads out all around town, and everyone who's sick and in need of healing comes to the house, and Jesus stays up late into the night, healing many of them. Finally, they all go to bed late, but when the disciples wake up in the morning, word has spread even further. Jesus' fame has spread even further. People are clamoring for their attention. People are clamoring for healing. There's a line outside the door already with more coming. And so the disciples realize, hey, we got to get up and go about work. We got important work to do. And they start looking for Jesus. But Jesus is nowhere to be found. They search all over for him, and eventually they find him. Jesus had slipped away early in the day to a deserted place to rest, to pray. And they finally find him in that place. And I can just see them coming to Jesus out of breath and saying, thank God we found you, Jesus. There are people clamoring for your attention. There are people in need of healing. They're lined up at the door. This is it, Jesus. We've made it. They're getting it. But Jesus says it's time to move on. We're not going back there. It was time to move to the next city because I've come to proclaim the good news there too. And I just can imagine the confusion among the disciples. I'm sure they must have been flabbergasted. And here it was, they thought they had it made. There were all the people clamoring for their attention, all the people in need of healing. That's what they'd been doing the night before. Jesus says it's time to move on. It doesn't seem to make any sense. Except that when we remember that when we take time to rest and pray, we're reconnected to God. And we're also reconnected to which, out of all the many things clamoring for our attention, we're reconnected in prayer to which of those things God is calling us to do right then. When we rest in prayer, we're able to weave our way through the busyness of our lives to find the business that God has called us to do at that time. You know, if you find yourself scattered and worn out trying to be a Christian, trying to do a million things at once, you might be missing something. If you find yourself running ragged, it might be because we've got it in our heads that we begin acting like it all depends upon us. We might find ourselves saying like, God's going to do great things. And then I add, as long as I do them for God. Right now, I know there are some things you have to do or they won't get done. You know, living the bachelor life, I quickly learned that if I don't cook dinner, it's not getting cooked. Didn't take long to learn that one. But then, if your fiancé moves to town, you don't have to cook dinner as much as you used to. The sweetest words in the English language are, would you like to cook dinner together? Right? And it's sometimes, I cook for her, sometimes she cooks for me. We're not going to talk about what the ratio of what that is. That's not the point. That's not the point for today. The point for today is this. When you know what the other is doing, and that's important, right? Because, otherwise we might end up with having 2 different dinners cooked, which I guess wouldn't be the problem. We might also end up with no dinners cooked. But when you know what the others are doing, when you see how what you're doing fits within a greater plan, life gets simpler. Life gets simpler when you see what you're doing fits within a bigger plan. So when we stop to rest, and we stop to be reacquainted with what God is doing, when we stop to rest and see what other Christians are doing, it helps us know what is the unique role that God is calling us to play. It's not that we're not going to work hard. We will, but we just have a clearer vision of what God is doing, what other Christians are doing. We realize that we're not in our lives of faith by ourselves. It doesn't all depend upon us because we're in a community. And we see what particular role we're called to play. It helps us cut through our busyness to find God's business for us. That's why Jesus called the disciples away to go on a retreat. And I can just imagine them there sitting out at night looking at the stars throughout the sky, or maybe sitting on a hillside watching the seas roll out in front of them. These fishermen who had great reverence for the sea, who had great respect for the stars that would guide them when they were fishing at night, I can just see them at night taking that all in. They knew the Hebrew Scriptures. So I can hear the words of the Psalms just rolling in their heads. Psalm 19, the heavens are telling the glory of God. The firmament's declaring His handiwork. I can see them just looking at the stars, looking at the waves, and seeing that as far as those stars stretch, as far as those waves roll, there is the glory of God. I can see them just sitting in wonder of this. Then I can hear them begin to speak in hushed whispers, not wanting to disturb the sovereignty of the night. I hear them begin to speak. They start talking about the wonders that they have seen. The blind receive sight. The lame walk. The lepers are cleansed. The poor have good news brought to them. I hear them begin to speak about this kingdom of God that Jesus is talking about, this place where all have enough, this place of justice and peace. And I hear them begin to realize that wherever Jesus goes, this kingdom of God begins to appear. I hear them begin to realize that this Jesus is the one their people have been waiting for centuries. And I begin to hear them begin to realize that this Jesus has a role for them to play in God's redemption story as they stop to rest, as they stop to wonder at what God has made, and as they stop to wonder at what they see Jesus doing. They see how God's at work in the world. When we stop to rest, we see how God is at work in the world. We see the work of God both in the creation that God has made and also in the things God is doing around us. When we just stop to rest and wonder over those things. You know, wonder, stopping in awe, stopping in wonder, it's one of the crucial parts of Christian life, but it's one we don't talk about all that much as we get caught up in our busyness. But one of my favorite passages in all of literature is about this notion of wonder. It comes from Alice Walker's book, The Color Purple. Right at the end, there are two of the characters now in the late stages of life are sitting together on a porch, and they're looking back over their lives. They've been difficult and tortuous lives, and these two characters they've kind of warred with each other in their younger years. But now in their older years, they've kind of mellowed out into peace, and they're sitting there on the porch, and they're talking to each other, and one says these words to the other. He says, "I think us here to wonder myself, to wonder, to ask. And that in wondering about the big things and asking about the big things, you learn about the little ones almost by accident. But you never know nothing more about the big things than you start out with. The more I wonder," he says, "the more I love. The more I wonder, the more I love." At the heart of our Christian faith, we have a series of mysteries we'll never fully understand. How is it that God is three but yet one, one but yet three? How is it exactly that the grace of God meets us in baptism and meets us at the communion table? You know, these aren't things that we'll ever be able to fully wrap up in some sort of scientific proof, and to be honest, that's not the point. But the point is that as we wonder over these things, as we wonder over a God whose love was so great it couldn't be held within a single person, but overflowed into the three persons of the Trinity, and then overflowed into creation, and overflowed into God's love for us, and overflowed in Christians' love for one another, as we wonder over that, as we wonder over our own experiences of God in baptism and communion, as we wonder over lives that are changed and transformed in baptism and in communion and in the other practices of the church, as we wonder over our own experiences of God, as we wonder over the God we see at work around us, we become transformed. We love more. We have more hope. We have more peace. We have more faith. We have more joy. Because we wondered over where God was at work. Now, Barrett, if you tell him what I'm about to say, he's probably never going to let me live it down. So I'm going to have to swear y'all to secrecy on this. But one of the fun things about being an associate minister is you very quickly get a long list of ways you can just get your senior ministers go. Can't give you the whole list today because I'd have to charge you. But I can give you a freebie. If you want to get Barrett riled up, all you have to say is George Strait did not deserve the ACM for Entertainer of the Year. His concerts are boring. If you go, all he does is sit in one place and sing. All you gotta do. All you gotta do. But as much fun as it is to tease Barrett about George Strait, King George understood this notion of resting in God's presence in one of his songs, which I already promised you I wouldn't try to sing today. But he gets this essence of what it means to rest in the wonder of God and be changed. The song where he sings, just walked down the street to the coffee shop. Had to take a break. I've been by her side for 18 hours straight. Saw a flower growing in the middle of the sidewalk, pushing up through the concrete, like it was planted right there for me to see. I saw God today. Whether it's a flower or a sunrise or new birth, the things that George sings about in the song, or whether it's the other things in our lives like friends and family, or whether it's the other things that we see in our lives like acts of kindness or acts of love, our own experiences of God's presence, whatever they might be. All of these signs we have that show us that God is still at work in the world, all of these signs that we have that say it doesn't all depend upon us. God's still at work directly. God's still at work through the church. It doesn't all depend upon us. All of these signs that we have, if we'll just rest long enough to wonder over them, if we'll just rest long enough to be changed by them, long enough to find our place, to see what God's doing, what others are doing, and how God is calling us specifically then to act, to be part of God's great story of redemption. We'll just rest long enough to figure that out. We'll begin to see a path through our busyness, which is God's true business for us. So you might protest and say you're too busy. And I'd say you're right. You're too busy not to rest. Too busy not to rest. Find your place. To rest in wonder. To let it change you. To find that true business that God has called you to do.